I was driving home from work late one stormy night when my car suddenly sputtered and died on an old, abandoned bridge. The rain was coming down in sheets, pounding against the windshield and obscuring my view of the road ahead. I tried to start the engine again, but all I got was the dreaded clicking sound of a dead battery. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no way to call for help. The only option was to sit tight and hope that someone would come along soon. As I sat in the darkness, listening to the rain drumming against the roof of my car, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that washed over me. It was eerily quiet out there, with nothing but the sound of a storm to keep me company. But then, just as I was starting to feel truly alone, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the direction of the bridge. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see through the rain-soaked windows, but all I could make out was the faint outline of a figure moving towards me. Fear gripped me as I realized that I was completely exposed out here on the bridge, with no way to defend myself if whoever was out there meant me harm. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to dial 911, but the screen remained stubbornly dark. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I was on my own out here, at the mercy of whoever was approaching in the darkness. Desperate for a way out, I unbuckled my seatbelt and flung open the car door, scrambling out into the pouring rain. My heart raced as I looked around, trying to spot any sign of movement in the darkness. And then, just as I was about to give up hope, I saw them, two shadowy figures emerging from the darkness, their faces hidden beneath the hoods of their jackets. My blood ran cold as I realized that these were not good Samaritans come to help me. They were something far more sinister. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, my feet slipping and sliding on the rain-soaked pavement as I sprinted towards the safety of the other side of the bridge. I could hear the sound of footsteps pounding behind me, growing closer with every step. But I refused to give up. I refused to let these people catch me and do God knows what to me out here in the middle of nowhere. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning and my legs aching as I ran faster than I ever had in my life. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw it, the end of the bridge looming up ahead, with the comforting glow of streetlights beckoning me towards safety. With one final burst of energy, I pushed myself forward, stumbling and tripping over the rough pavement as I raced towards freedom. And then, just as I reached the other side of the bridge, I heard a voice calling out to me from behind. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't dare, but I could hear the urgency in their tone, the desperation to catch me before I slipped away. But I was too fast, too determined to escape, and before they could reach me, I was already disappearing into the darkness, leaving them behind on the abandoned bridge. As I ran, the rain still pounding down around me, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't managed to escape, if I hadn't found the strength to keep going when all hope seemed lost. But I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on putting as much distance between me and the bridge as possible. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the nearest town, where I collapsed onto the sidewalk, gasping for breath and shaking with fear. It was only then, as I sat there in the dim glow of the streetlights, that I allowed myself to truly process what had just happened, the terror of being trapped on that bridge, with nowhere to run and no one to help me. But I was alive. I had made it out alive, and that was all that mattered. And as I sat there, waiting for the police to arrive and take my statement, I couldn't help but feel a surge of gratitude for the small miracle that had allowed me to escape the clutches of those who meant me harm. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was home alone, curled up on the couch with a book in hand. The sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the house, creating a cozy atmosphere. But then, out of nowhere, there came a knock at the door. I hesitated, wondering who could be out in this weather, but curiosity got the better of me. I made my way to the door and peered through the peephole, but all I could see was the dim outline of a figure standing on the porch. Feeling a twinge of sympathy for whoever was out there in the rain, I decided to open the door and see what they wanted. As soon as I did, a man stepped forward, his clothes soaked through and his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked at me with pleading eyes and explained that his car had broken down just down the road, and he needed to use a phone to call for help. I hesitated, unsure if I should let a stranger into my home, but something about his demeanor seemed genuine. Reluctantly, I stepped aside and allowed him to come in, leading him to the phone in the kitchen. As he dialed the number, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. There was something off about this man, something that made my skin crawl. But before I could act on my instincts, he turned to me with a smile and thanked me for letting him use the phone. And then, without warning, he lunged forward, his hands wrapping around my throat with surprising strength. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was in danger, that this man was not who he seemed. I fought back with all the strength I had, kicking and screaming as I struggled to break free from his grasp. But he was relentless, his grip tightening around my neck with every passing second. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, threatening to swallow me whole. And then, just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I saw it, a glint of metal on the counter beside me. With a surge of desperation, I reached out and grabbed the knife, plunging it into the man's side with all the force I could muster. He let out a cry of pain and stumbled backwards, releasing his grip on my throat. Gasping for breath, I scrambled away from him, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched him collapse to the floor. But I knew I couldn't stay there. I knew I had to get up before he regained his strength and came after me again. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my voice trembling as I explained what had happened. Within minutes, the police were at my door, taking the man into custody and ensuring that I was safe. And as I sat there in the aftermath of the ordeal, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. I had survived. I had managed to escape from the clutches of a dangerous stranger. And although the memory of that terrifying night would stay with me forever, I knew that I would never again underestimate the importance of trusting my instincts and staying vigilant, even in the safety of my own home. It was a dreary day, rain pouring down relentlessly as I trudged through the mud, my boots sinking into the soggy ground with every step. I was part of a road crew tasked with restoring power to a small village that had been plunged into darkness by the storm. As I worked, the rain continued to fall, turning the road into a river of mud and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But despite the miserable conditions, I pressed on, determined to finish the job and get out of there as quickly as possible. Suddenly, I heard voices in the distance, faint and indistinct over the sound of the rain. I glanced around, trying to locate the source of the noise, but all I could see was the empty road stretching out before me. Ignoring the unease that crept over me, I continued to work, hoping that the voices were just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as the minutes passed, the voices grew louder, closer, until I could make out what they were saying. They were speaking in hushed tones, their words muffled by the rain, but I could hear the urgency in their voices, the sense of urgency that sent a chill down my spine. I strained to make out what they were saying, but the words were lost in the sound of the storm. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them, a group of figures emerging from the trees, their faces hidden beneath hoods and their footsteps silent against the muddy ground. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them approach, a sense of dread washing over me like a wave. I tried to focus on my work, to block out the fear that threatened to consume me, but it was no use. The figures drew closer, their movements slow and deliberate, and I knew that I was in danger. Without a second thought, I dropped my tools and turned to run, my heart pounding in my chest as I sprinted down the road, my boots slipping and sliding in the mud. But no matter how fast I ran, the figures seemed to be gaining on me, their footsteps growing louder with each passing moment. I glanced over my shoulder, terror coursing through my veins as I saw them closing in, their faces twisted into masks of malice. I knew that I had to find help, to get out of there before it was too late. But just as I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw a flicker of light up ahead, the village, its windows glowing with the warm glow of electricity. With renewed determination, I pushed myself forward, my legs aching and my lungs burning with exertion. Finally, I reached the outskirts of the village, my chest heaving as I stumbled into the nearest house, banging on the door and begging for help. The door swung open, and I collapsed into the arms of the homeowner, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to explain what had happened. But as I looked back towards the road, I saw no sign of the figures that had been chasing me, no trace of the terror that had haunted me only moments before. And as I sat there, safe and sound in the warmth of the house, I couldn't help but wonder, had it all been a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear? But deep down, I knew the truth. I had come face to face with something truly sinister out there in the rain, something that I couldn't explain or comprehend. The rain poured down as I stood by the side of the deserted road, the sound of thunder rumbling in the distance. My motorbike had broken down, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere with no shelter in sight. I cursed under my breath as I tried to figure out what was wrong, the rain soaking through my clothes and chilling me to the bone. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would catch a movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end nonetheless. I tried to focus on fixing my bike, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger with each passing minute. It was as if someone or something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I glanced around nervously, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to see through the darkness. And then, just when I was about to give up hope, I saw a figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees, watching me with cold, unblinking eyes. Fear gripped me like a vice as I realized that I wasn't alone out here on this deserted road. Someone or something was out there, and they had been watching me the entire time. I considered making a run for it, but the figure was between me and my bike, and I knew that I wouldn't stand a chance of escaping on foot. My only option was to stay put and hope that whoever or whatever was out there would leave me alone. I forced myself to focus on my bike, my hands trembling as I tried to fix whatever was wrong. But every now and then, I would glance up and see the figure still standing there, watching me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. And then, just when I was starting to lose hope, I heard a noise behind me, a twig snapping underfoot. I whirled around, my heart in my throat as I searched the darkness for any sign of movement. But there was nothing there. No figure, no shadowy shape lurking in the trees. Just the sound of the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. I told myself that I was just being paranoid, that there was nothing out there but my own fear. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Someone or something had been watching me, and they were still out there, lurking in the darkness. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I needed to get out of there, and fast. I abandoned my bike and started to run, my footsteps echoing in the empty silence of the night as I fled into the darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest town, where I collapsed on the doorstep of the nearest house, gasping for breath as I tried to process what had just happened. But even as I lay there, shaking and exhausted, I knew that I had escaped whatever had been out there on that deserted road. And as I listened to the sound of the rain pounding against the windows, I said a silent prayer of thanks for my narrow escape. The rain poured down relentlessly as I drove along the deserted road, the windshield wipers barely able to keep up with the deluge. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a group of masked figures appeared in the middle of the road, blocking my path. Before I could react, they smashed my windows and dragged me out of the car, their faces hidden behind ski masks. I struggled against them, but they were too strong. They tied my hands behind my back and blindfolded me before dragging me into the nearby woods. I could hear their muffled voices as they discussed what to do with me, their words sending shivers down my spine. I was left alone in the darkness, tied up and helpless, the sound of the rain masking any hope of escape. Panic threatened to consume me as I struggled against my bonds, but they held fast, cutting into my skin with each desperate tug. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as I lay there in the darkness, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't know who these people were or what they wanted from me, but I knew that I needed to find a way out before it was too late. With every ounce of strength I had left, I wriggled and squirmed, trying to loosen the ropes that bound me. It felt like an eternity, but finally, after what must have been hours, I felt the knot start to give way. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to free my hands and tear off the blindfold, blinking in the dim light of the forest. But I knew I wasn't safe yet. I had to move fast if I wanted to get out of here alive. Ignoring the pain in my wrists, I scrambled to my feet and started to run, my heart pounding in my chest as I crashed through the underbrush. The rain soaked through my clothes, making every step feel like a struggle, but I didn't dare stop. I could hear the sounds of pursuit behind me, the shouts of my captors echoing through the trees. I pushed myself to go faster, my lungs burning with exertion as I dodged branches and roots in the darkness. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I burst out of the trees and into a clearing, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I scanned the horizon for any sign of civilization. And then, in the distance, I saw the faint glow of streetlights, beckoning me to safety. With a surge of relief, I pushed myself to go faster, the sounds of pursuit fading behind me as I raced toward the lights. I stumbled and fell more than once, but I refused to give up. I had come too far to let them catch me now. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I burst out onto the main road, my heart pounding in my chest as I collapsed on the pavement. I was safe. I was free. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. I had escaped from those masked assailants against all odds, and now I was alive to tell the tale. But even as I caught my breath and let the rain wash away the dirt and grime of the forest, the rain poured down in torrents as I sat in my car, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. I glanced out at the desolate stretch of road ahead, feeling a sense of unease creeping over me. As the minutes ticked by, the sense of being watched only intensified, sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, lurking in the darkness just beyond the reach of my headlights. I tried to brush off my unease, telling myself that it was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. And then, just as I was about to dismiss my fears as irrational, I saw a shadowy figure lurking in the trees at the edge of the road. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that I was now alone out here in the darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, my hands trembling as I dialed for help. But as the line rang out, I realized with a sinking feeling that there was no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. I was on my own, with no way to call for help and no idea what or who was lurking out there in the darkness. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, leaving me feeling vulnerable and exposed. I knew I needed to get out of here, to find somewhere safe until help arrived. But as I opened the car door and stepped out into the rain, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every rustle of leaves sending my heart racing. I moved quickly, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement as I searched for shelter from the storm. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw a small, run-down cabin nestled among the trees. Relief flooded through me as I hurried toward it, praying that it would provide some respite from the storm. But as I approached the cabin, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life inside. It was as if the cabin had been abandoned for years. I hesitated for a moment, torn between seeking shelter and fleeing back to the safety of my car. But the thought of spending another minute out here in the rain was too much to bear. With a deep breath, I pushed open the door and stepped inside, the creak of the hinges echoing through the empty space. The interior was musty and dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and cobwebs clinging to the corners. I moved cautiously through the rooms, my senses on high alert as I searched for any sign of danger. But aside from the eerie stillness, there was nothing to indicate that anyone or anything was lurking in the shadows. Relief washed over me as I settled into a corner, the warmth of the cabin providing some small comfort against the chill of the storm outside. But even as I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced nervously out the window, half expecting to see someone or something lurking in the darkness. But the only thing staring back at me was my own reflection, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. I tried to push aside my fears, telling myself that I was safe now. But deep down, I knew that something was still out there, waiting in the darkness just beyond the reach of my sight. Hours passed in agonizing silence as I waited for the storm to pass, my nerves stretched to the breaking point. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, sending my imagination into overdrive as I imagined all manner of horrors lurking just beyond the cabin walls. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the storm began to subside, the rain tapering off into a gentle drizzle. With a sigh of relief, I gathered my courage and stepped back out into the night. The air was thick with fog as I made my way back to my car, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty darkness. But as I reached the edge of the road, I froze. There, standing in the middle of the road, was the shadowy figure I had seen earlier. My blood ran cold as I realized that I was now alone out here in the darkness. Without a moment's hesitation, I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced back toward the safety of the cabin. I could hear the figure behind me, their footsteps echoing through the night as they pursued me relentlessly. But I refused to give up. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself to go faster, my lungs burning with exertion as I fought to stay ahead of my pursuer. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I burst back into the clearing where the cabin stood, the sight of its withered walls filling me with a sense of hope. With a final burst of speed, I raced toward the cabin, throwing open the door and diving inside just as the figure behind me reached out to grab me. I slammed the door shut behind me, panting for breath as I leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. I managed to secure the door and stayed in there for a few hours until I knew he was gone. Once the coast was clear, I got the hell out of there. The rain was heavy as I drove down the dark, winding road. Thunder rumbled in the distance, adding to the ominous atmosphere as I navigated through the storm. As I rounded a bend, I saw a flicker of light up ahead, a small gathering of people standing in the cemetery. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowed down to get a closer look. The rain pounded against the windshield as I squinted through the gloom, trying to make out what was happening. As I drew nearer, I could see that the group was holding a vigil around a freshly dug grave. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a sense of unease creeping over me. Something about the scene seemed off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The people gathered around the grave were silent, their faces obscured by the shadows cast by their umbrellas. I debated whether to stop and investigate further, but a voice in the back of my mind warned me to stay away. There was something about the situation that didn't sit right with me, and I didn't want to get involved in something I didn't understand. With a sense of foreboding, I decided to keep driving, putting as much distance between myself and the cemetery as possible. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the group fade into the distance, their figures becoming nothing more than silhouettes against the backdrop of the storm. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the pit of my stomach as I continued on my way. The rain continued to fall, the sound of it drumming against the roof of my car like a steady heartbeat. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat, every rustle of leaves sending a chill down my spine. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to focus on the road ahead. But no matter how hard I tried to push the feeling away, it lingered like a shadow at the edge of my consciousness. I knew I needed to do something, to shake off this sense of impending doom that hung over me like a dark cloud. With a trembling hand, I reached for my phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained what I had seen at the cemetery. The dispatcher assured me that they would send someone to investigate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. With a sense of urgency, I continued on my way, my eyes darting nervously from side to side as I scanned the road for any sign of trouble. Minutes stretched into hours as I drove, the rain showing no signs of letting up. I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I finally saw the lights of a police car in the distance, their flashing blue and red lights cutting through the darkness like beacons of hope. I pulled over to the side of the road and watched as the officers approached, their expressions grim as they listened to my story. I felt a sense of validation wash over me as I recounted what I had seen at the cemetery, knowing that I had done the right thing by alerting them to the possible danger. With a nod of thanks, the officers assured me that they would handle the situation from here. As I watched them disappear into the night, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, knowing that I had done my part to ensure the safety of others. As I continued on my way, the rain began to taper off, the storm finally passing as quickly as it had come. But even as the skies cleared, I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark and sinister lurked just beyond the edge of my vision. I knew that I would never forget what I had seen that night, and that the memory of the mysterious vigil in the cemetery would haunt me for the rest of my days. But for now, I was grateful to be alive, knowing that I had escaped whatever danger lurked in the darkness. It was pouring rain that night, and things between me and my partner, Mark, had escalated into a full-blown argument. We were driving home after a dinner party, but the tension in the car was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I could feel Mark's anger radiating off him like heat waves, and it made me uneasy. As we drove through the dark, rain-soaked streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white, and his jaw was clenched so tight, I thought it might snap. I tried to make small talk to lighten the mood, but he just grunted in response, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I glanced over at him and saw the anger burning in his eyes, and it sent a shiver down my spine. It was like he was a completely different person, someone I didn't recognize. I felt a knot form in the pit of my stomach, and I knew I had to get out of the car, but there was nowhere to go. We were miles from home, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just a stupid argument, and everything would be fine once we got home. But as we drove further into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I kept glancing over at Mark, but he just stared straight ahead, his jaw still clenched tight. Suddenly, he took a sharp turn down a dark, deserted road, and my heart started racing. I asked him where he was going, but he just ignored me, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I felt a surge of panic rising inside me, and I knew I had to get out of the car before it was too late. I reached for the door handle, but Mark slammed on the brakes, sending me flying forward against the dashboard. He turned to me with a wild look in his eyes, and I realized then that I was in serious danger. I screamed for him to let me out, but he just laughed and grabbed me by the arm, dragging me back into my seat. I fought against him with all my strength, but he was too strong, and I was no match for him. He leaned in close, his hot breath tickling my ear, and whispered something so sinister it made my blood run cold. I knew then that I had to get away from him, no matter what it took. I waited for the perfect moment, and when he was distracted by something outside, I made a break for it. I flung open the door and tumbled out of the car, rolling onto the wet pavement. I scrambled to my feet and ran as fast as I could, the rain pelting down on me like icy daggers. I didn't look back, not even once, afraid that if I did, I'd see more coming after me. I ran until my lungs were burning and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station. I collapsed onto the pavement, sobbing with relief, knowing that I had escaped with my life. With each passing mile, the storm seemed to grow stronger, the wind howling outside as if it were trying to tear the world apart. As I rounded a bend, I caught sight of an old shack nestled among the trees. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but in that moment, it seemed like a sanctuary from the raging storm outside. With a sense of relief, I pulled off the road and parked my car, making a dash for the shelter of the shack. The door creaked open on rusty hinges as I stepped inside, the musty smell of damp wood filling my nostrils. I closed the door behind me and took a moment to catch my breath, the sound of the rain still echoing in my ears. But as I listened, I realized that there was another sound mixed in with the rain, a faint scratching coming from outside. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to hear more. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of something moving in the darkness just beyond the walls of the shack. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I might not be as alone as I had thought. I cursed myself for seeking shelter in such a remote and isolated place, knowing that I was completely at the mercy of whatever lurked outside. I considered making a run for it, but the storm outside showed no signs of letting out, and I knew that I wouldn't stand a chance against the elements. Instead, I hunkered down in the corner of the shack, my heart racing as I waited for whatever was out there to make its move. Minutes stretched into hours as I sat there in the darkness, the sound of the rain and the scratching outside the only things keeping me company. With each passing moment, the feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach grew stronger, until it felt like I was drowning in it. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination running wild, that there was nothing out there but the wind and the rain. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Whatever was lurking in the darkness was real, and it was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Suddenly, the scratching outside grew louder, closer, until it sounded like it was right outside the door. I held my breath, my entire body tensing as I waited for whatever was out there to reveal itself. And then, without warning, the door burst open, flooding the shack with blinding light. I shielded my eyes against the sudden glare, my heart pounding in my chest as I braced myself for the worst. But instead of some terrifying creature from the depths of my nightmares, I was greeted by the sight of a flashlight beam and the sound of voices shouting over the storm. It was a search party, come to rescue me from the abandoned shack and take me to safety. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled out into the rain, grateful to be alive and surrounded by other people once more. As I followed the search party back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me from the darkness, biding its time until the storm passed and it could strike again. But for now, I was safe, and that was all that mattered. As the lights of the town came into view, I made a silent vow never to venture into the wilderness alone again. I was walking my dog through the park one rainy night. My dog, Max, trotted happily beside me, his tail wagging as he sniffed at the wet grass. As we made our way along the winding paths, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was late, and the park was deserted, the only light coming from the occasional street lamp casting long shadows across the empty pathways. I glanced over my shoulder, but there was no one there, just the darkness stretching out behind us like an endless abyss. Still, the feeling of unease persisted, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness like a hungry animal. I quickened my pace, eager to get home and out of the rain. But no matter how fast I walked, the feeling of being watched never left me, hovering just beyond the reach of my senses like a shadow in the night. Suddenly, Max stopped in his tracks, his ears pricking up as he sniffed at the air. I followed his gaze, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I tried to call out to them, to ask if they needed help or if they were lost. But the words caught in my throat, suffocated by the weight of fear that pressed down on me like a physical force. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, their eyes fixed on me with an unblinking stare that made my skin crawl. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they melted back into the darkness, disappearing into the night like a ghost. I wanted to run, to flee from the park and never look back. But something held me rooted to the spot, some primal instinct telling me that to move would be to invite disaster. I glanced down at Max, but he seemed unfazed by the encounter, his tail still wagging as he sniffed at the ground. It was as if he hadn't seen the figure at all, as if they were nothing more than a trick of the light. But I knew better. I could still feel the weight of their gaze on me, a silent threat that lingered long after they had vanished into the night. With a trembling hand, I reached for my phone, my fingers fumbling with the screen as I tried to dial for help. But when I looked up, the figure was back, closer this time, their eyes burning with a cold, unyielding intensity. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as they stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate. Panic surged through me, threatening to overwhelm my senses as I scrambled to find some way to defend myself. But before I could react, Max lunged forward, his teeth bared in a menacing snarl. The figure hesitated, taken aback by the sudden aggression, and in that moment, I saw my chance. With a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength, I turned and ran, Max at my heels as we tore through the park in a desperate bid for freedom. Behind us, I could hear the sound of footsteps pounding on the wet pavement, growing closer with each passing moment. I didn't dare to look back, didn't dare to see what horrors lurked in the darkness behind me. I just ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced towards the safety of home. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I saw the lights of civilization looming ahead, the promise of safety and sanctuary beckoning me forward like a guiding star. With one final burst of speed, I pushed myself forward, my legs burning with exertion as I sprinted towards the safety of the streetlights. And then, with a cry of relief, I stumbled into the waiting arms of a passerby, collapsing against them in a flood of tears and adrenaline. They must have seen the terror in my eyes, the raw fear that still gripped me even as I clung to the safety of their embrace. But they didn't ask questions, didn't pry into the horrors that had chased me through the night. Instead, they wrapped their arms around me and held me close, offering comfort and solace in the midst of my terror. And as I buried my face in their shoulder, I knew that I was safe, that whatever had been lurking in the darkness would never be able to reach me again. For in that moment, I was no longer alone. I was surrounded by the warmth and light of humanity, a beacon of hope in the endless sea of darkness that stretched out before me. And as long as I had that, I knew that I would always be able to find my way home. The rain poured down relentlessly as I drove along the deserted highway, the sound of the water drumming against the roof of my car like a constant, ominous drumbeat. The night was dark and cold, the only light coming from the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the darkness. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw it, a flash of light up ahead, flickering like a dying flame in the distance. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what it was, a distress signal. coming from a stranded motorist on the side of the road. Without hesitation, I pulled over, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone to call for help. But as I stepped out of the car and approached the other vehicle, a sense of unease washed over me like a wave crashing against the shore. The car was empty, its doors standing open like gaping mouths in the darkness. There was no sign of the motorist, no indication of what had happened to them. And then, as I drew closer, I saw it, a glint of metal in the shadows, the unmistakable shape of a knife gleaming in the dim light. My blood ran cold as I realized what was happening. This wasn't a stranded motorist in need of help. It was a trap, set by someone with malicious intent. Panic surged through me, threatening to overwhelm my senses as I turned to flee back to my car. But it was too late. They were already upon me, emerging from the darkness like wraiths from the depths of hell. Their faces were hidden behind masks, their movements swift and precise as they closed in around me, trapping me like a cornered animal. I tried to fight back, to scream for help, but the words caught in my throat, stifled by the weight of fear that pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. All around me, I could hear the sound of their laughter, low and menacing like the growl of a hungry predator. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, I broke free from their grasp and bolted towards my car, my heart pounding in my chest like a drumbeat of impending doom. But they were faster, stronger, their hands closing around me like iron chains, dragging me back into the darkness. I struggled against them, kicking and screaming as they pinned me to the ground, their laughter echoing in my ears like the tolling of a death knell. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I saw it, a glimmer of light in the distance, the unmistakable shape of headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of salvation. With a surge of desperate hope, I redoubled my efforts, fighting with every ounce of strength I had left. And then, with a final burst of adrenaline-fueled energy, I broke free from their grasp and staggered towards the light, my heart pounding in my chest like a jackhammer. I reached the car just as the driver stepped out, their face a mask of concern as they rushed to my side. Without a word, they helped me into the safety of their vehicle, their presence a comforting reassurance in the midst of the chaos. As we drove away from the scene, I glanced back at the deserted highway. The image of those masked figures burned into my memory like a brand. But I knew that I was safe now, that I had escaped the clutches of those who would do me harm. And as the rain continued to fall outside, I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to be alive and thankful for the stranger who had come to my rescue. For in that moment, I knew that I would always be able to find my way home, no matter how dark the road ahead may seem. It was a rainy night, the kind where the rain falls in heavy sheets, obscuring everything in its path. I was walking through the woods, trying to clear my head after a long day at work, when I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Through the trees, I could see a flickering light in the distance, accompanied by the sound of chanting. Intrigued, I crept closer, careful to stay hidden in the shadows. As I got closer, I could make out figures gathered around a bonfire, their faces obscured by the darkness. But even from a distance, I could sense something sinister about them, something that sent shivers down my spine. As I watched, transfixed, the chanting grew louder, more intense. It sent a chill down my spine, a feeling of unease settling in the pit of my stomach. I knew I should turn back, leave well enough alone and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But curiosity got the better of me, urging me forward despite the warning bells ringing in my head. As I crept closer, trying to get a better look, I stumbled over a branch, the snap echoing through the silent forest like a gunshot. My heart pounding in my chest, I froze, praying that I hadn't been hurt. But it was too late. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, to my horror, the cultists turned as one, their eyes locking onto me with a predatory gleam. I knew then that I had been discovered, but there was no way out of this alive. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I turned to flee, but before I could take a single step, I felt a hand close around my wrist, pulling me back into the darkness. I struggled, fought with everything I had, but it was no use. The cultists were too strong, their grip too tight. As they dragged me towards the bonfire, I caught a glimpse of the twisted smiles on their faces, the madness in their eyes. I knew then that I was in for something far worse than I could have ever imagined. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I was about to become a part of something truly horrifying, something that would haunt me for the rest of my days. But just as all hope seemed lost, I heard a voice in the darkness, a voice that sounded like an angel's choir to my ears. It was the sound of sirens, the sound of rescue. With a renewed sense of hope, I redoubled my efforts to break free, fighting with everything I had as the cultists closed in around me. And then, just when it seemed like all was lost, I felt the grip on my wrist loosen, felt myself being pulled away from the darkness and into the light. As the police arrived, guns drawn and voices shouting commands, I collapsed to the ground, my body racked with sobs of relief. I was safe from the clutches of the cultists by the timely arrival of the authorities. But even as I lay there, surrounded by the chaos of the rescue, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something truly evil, something that would haunt me for the rest of my days. It was one of those nights where the rain fell in a relentless downpour, the kind of rain that makes you want to stay indoors and curl up with a good book. But I had to walk home from work, and there was no avoiding it. As I trudged through the streets, my umbrella held tightly over my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around nervously, but the streets were empty save for a few stray cats and the occasional car driving by. Desperate to escape the rain and warm up a bit, I ducked into a diner I passed by. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and I shook the rain off my coat before taking a seat at the counter. The diner was quiet, save for the soft hum of conversation and the sizzle of the grill in the kitchen. I ordered a coffee and tried to relax, but the feeling of being watched persisted. I glanced around the diner, trying to spot whoever was staring at me, but all I saw were a few tired-looking patrons huddled over their meals. And then I saw them. 3 men sitting at a table in the corner, their eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to ignore them, to focus on my coffee and pretend like everything was normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I finished my coffee and got up to leave, the 3 men stood up as well, their eyes never leaving me. My heart began to race as I realized they were following me. I quickened my pace, trying to put some distance between us, but no matter how fast I walked, they were always right behind me. I turned down side streets, hoping to lose them in the maze of alleyways, but they were relentless, their footsteps echoing ominously in the empty streets. Panic began to rise in my chest as I realized I was being hunted, that these men meant me harm. I had to think fast, find a way to escape before it was too late. I ducked into an alley and hid behind a dumpster, holding my breath as I listened for any sign of my pursuers. But all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, the sound of my ragged breath echoing in my ears. And then I saw them, their shadows looming large in the dim light of the alley. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me, but it was no use. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that there was no way out, that I was trapped with nowhere to run. But just as all hope seemed lost, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Relief flooded through me as I realized that help was on the way. The men froze, their faces pale with fear as the police cars pulled up, lights flashing and sirens blaring. With a shout, the officers leaped out of their cars, guns drawn and ready for action. The men tried to run, but they were no match for the police. Within moments, they were in handcuffs, their plans foiled and their reign of terror at an end. As the officers led them away, I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to be alive and safe once more. It was a night I would never forget, a night that reminded me just how fragile life can be. But as I walked home, the memory of those 3 men following me haunted my thoughts, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks in the shadows, waiting to strike when you least expect it. I had been driving for hours. The rain was coming down really bad and all I wanted was to get home and crawl into bed. But fate had other plans for me. As I rounded a bend, I felt a sudden jolt and my car swerved to the side of the road. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I realized that I had a flat tire. I pulled over to the side of the road, the rain beating down on the roof of my car as I struggled to keep my composure. I had never changed a tire before, and the thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere filled me with dread. But I knew I had no choice. With trembling hands, I grabbed the jack and the spare tire from the trunk and set to work. As I struggled to loosen the lug nuts, I heard a noise in the distance, a rustling in the bushes that sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced around nervously, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I realized that I was not alone. Someone, or something, was out there in the darkness, watching me. But I pushed aside my fear and focused on the task at hand. I had to get this tire changed and get back on the road as quickly as possible. As I worked, the rain continued to pour down, soaking me to the bone and making it difficult to see. But I refused to give up, determined to get out of this situation alive. Just as I was about to finish changing the tire, I heard footsteps approaching from behind. My heart raced as I turned to see a group of figures emerging from the darkness, their faces obscured by the shadows. Panic gripped me as I realized that I was in serious danger. These people were not here to help me. They were here to harm me, or worse. With trembling hands, I fumbled for my phone, my fingers slipping on the wet screen as I tried to call for help. But to my horror, I realized that I had no signal. Desperation washed over me as I realized that I was completely on my own. With nowhere to turn for help, I knew that I had to rely on my own wits to survive. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I realized that I had to make a run for it. With one last desperate glance at the figures approaching me, I grabbed the tire iron and sprinted into the darkness. The rain pounded down on me as I ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to put distance between myself and my pursuers. I could hear them shouting behind me, their voices filled with malice and intent. But I refused to give up. I pushed myself harder, running faster than I ever thought possible as I tried to outpace my pursuers. With every step, the darkness seemed to close in around me, threatening to swallow me whole. But I refused to let it. I pushed forward, driven by nothing but sheer determination and the will to survive. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw lights in the distance. With a surge of hope, I pushed myself even harder, my legs burning with exertion as I ran towards safety. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I reached the lights. I stumbled into a gas station, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I collapsed on the ground. But I was safe. I had escaped from whatever horror had been lurking in the darkness, and I was alive. As I lay there, catching my breath, I couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful to be alive, and grateful for the simple act of breathing. And as I lay there, surrounded by the comforting glow of the gas station lights, I knew that I would never forget the terror of that night. The rain hammered against the windows as I sat alone in my apartment, the only sound the steady rhythm of droplets hitting the glass. It was a cold, rainy night, and I was grateful to be inside, safe and warm. But then, out of nowhere, the shrill ring of my phone shattered the silence, causing me to jump in surprise. I glanced at the caller ID, but the number was unfamiliar. With a sense of unease creeping over me, I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" I said tentatively, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before a voice spoke, low and menacing. "Hello, Jack," it said, sending a chill down my spine. "I know your secrets, Jack. I know everything about you." My heart pounded in my chest as I listened to the voice on the other end of the line, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Who was this person, and how did they know so much about me? But before I could respond, the voice continued, its tone growing more taunting and sinister with each word. "You can't hide from me, Jack. I'm always watching. And if you don't do exactly what I say, there will be consequences." My blood ran cold as I listened to the caller's threats, my mind whirling with fear and uncertainty. Who was this person, and what did they want from me? But as the call dragged on, I realized that there was no escaping the terror that had suddenly invaded my life. I was being targeted by someone with a sinister agenda, and I had no idea how to stop them. With a sense of dread gnawing in my insides, I hung up the phone and sank onto the couch, my mind reeling with fear and confusion. What was I going to do? As I sat there, lost in my own thoughts, the phone rang again, its shrill sound cutting through the silence like a knife. With a sense of dread, I picked it up, bracing myself for another round of threats and taunts. But this time, it was different. This time, the caller's voice was filled with urgency and desperation. "Jack, you have to listen to me," they said, their voice shaking with fear. "You're in danger, Jack. You have to get out of there before it's too late." My heart pounded in my chest as I listened to the caller's words, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. What did they mean? I was in danger. And how did they know what was happening to me? But before I could respond, the line went dead, leaving me alone in the darkness with nothing but my own thoughts and fears for company. With a sense of urgency, I jumped to my feet and began to pack a bag, throwing clothes and essentials into a backpack as quickly as I could. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do, but I knew that I had to get out of there before it was too late. As I hurried to the door, my heart pounding in my chest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was out there in the darkness, waiting for me. But I pushed aside my fear and focused on the task at hand. I had to get out of there, and fast. With trembling hands, I flung open the door and stepped out into the night, the rain pouring down around me as I ran for my life. I didn't know where I was going or what was waiting for me out there in the darkness, but I knew that I had to keep moving, that I had to escape from the terror that had suddenly invaded my life. And as I ran, the sound of my own footsteps echoing in my ears, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that someone was out there in the darkness, hunting me down with a sinister agenda. But I refused to give up. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself harder, running faster than I ever thought possible as I tried to outpace my pursuer. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, I saw lights in the distance, the comforting glow of safety beckoning me forward. With a surge of hope, I pushed myself even harder, my legs burning with exertion as I ran towards salvation. And as I reached the lights, collapsing onto the pavement in exhaustion, I knew that I had escaped from the terror that had threatened to consume me, that I had made it out alive. It was a rainy night, and I was driving home from work, the sound of rain drumming against the windshield drowning out the radio. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw the headlights of a car swerve out of control, skidding across the slick pavement before crashing into a tree. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side of the road. I could see the mangled wreckage of the car, steam rising from the engine as the rain poured down around it. Without hesitation, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling as I waited for someone to answer. As I spoke to the dispatcher, I could hear the screams of the trapped passengers coming from the wreckage, their cries for help echoing in the darkness. I knew I had to do something to help them in any way I could. Ignoring the rain, I ran towards the red car, my heart racing as I approached. But as I got closer, something didn't feel right. The scene seemed off somehow, as if it had been staged, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I reached the car and tried to open the door, but it was stuck fast. I could hear the panicked cries of the passengers inside, their voices pleading for help as they struggled to free themselves from the wreckage. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed a nearby rock and smashed it against the window, shattering the glass into 1,000 pieces. I reached inside and began pulling the injured passengers out one by one, doing my best to keep them calm as I worked to free them from the twisted metal. But as I pulled the last survivor from the wreckage, something caught my eye, a glint of metal tucked away in the back seat. My blood ran cold as I realized what it was, a gun, hidden from view beneath a pile of clothing. Fear gripped me as I looked around, my mind racing with the possibilities. Had this been an accident, or was there something more sinister at play? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong about the situation, something that didn't add up. As I helped the survivors to safety, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the pit of my stomach. I knew I had to do something, to find out the truth about what had really happened on that rainy night. I called the police and reported the accident, telling them everything I had seen and heard. But even as I spoke to the dispatcher, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that there was more to this story than met the eye. Hours passed as I waited for the police to arrive, each minute feeling like an eternity as I replayed the events of that evening over and over again in my mind. What had caused the accident? And why did I feel like the survivors were hiding something from me? When the police finally arrived, I led them to the scene of the crash and recounted everything I had witnessed. But as they began to investigate, my worst fears were confirmed. The accident had been staged, a deliberate attempt to cover up a much darker crime. The survivors were taken into custody, their true intentions revealed as the police uncovered evidence of foul play hidden in the wreckage. It turned out that they had been involved in a robbery gone wrong, and the accident had been their desperate attempt to escape justice. As I watched them being led away in handcuffs, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I had helped to uncover the truth, to bring those responsible to justice, and for that, I would always be grateful. But even as the ordeal came to an end, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of my mind. The thought that I had come so close to danger, that I had been just a heartbeat away from becoming another victim of their twisted plot, haunted me long after the police had left the scene. The rain was coming down hard as I drove along the deserted highway, the sound of the downpour drumming against the roof of my car. It was late, and the darkness outside seemed to swallow up everything in its path. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw someone standing on the side of the highway, their thumb outstretched in a silent plea for help. Without really thinking, I slowed down and pulled over, rolling down the window to offer them a ride. The person, a young man with a backpack slung over his shoulder, approached the car cautiously. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "I really appreciate it." I nodded, gesturing for him to get in. "No problem," I said, trying to sound friendly despite the unease I felt creeping over me. "Where are you headed?" The man hesitated for a moment before answering. "Just up the road a bit," he said, his eyes darting nervously around the car. "Anywhere is fine, really. I just need to get out of this rain." I nodded again, my grip tightening on the steering wheel as I pulled back onto the road. Something about the man's demeanor seemed off, and a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy weight. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the man sitting beside me was not who he claimed to be. But I tried to push aside my fears and focus on the road ahead, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But then, out of nowhere, a man turned to me with a strange look in his eyes. "You shouldn't have picked me up," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into." My heart pounded in my chest as I listened to his words, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. What did he mean? I shouldn't have picked him up. And what was he going to do to me? But before I could respond, the man reached into his backpack and pulled out a knife, holding it inches from my throat. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with malice. "But I can't let you go now. You know too much." Panic surged through me as I realized the danger I was in, the realization hitting me like a ton of bricks. I was trapped in a car with a dangerous stranger, with no way to escape. With trembling hands, I tried to think of a way out of the nightmare that had suddenly engulfed me. But the man's grip on the knife was firm, and I knew that any sudden movements could spell disaster. But just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw a glimmer of light up ahead, the glow of a roadside diner beckoning me forward. With a surge of adrenaline, I slammed on the gas pedal and swerved off the road, the car skidding to a stop in the parking lot. As soon as the car came to a halt, I flung open the door and bolted out into the rain, my heart pounding in my chest as I ran towards the safety of the diner. But as I reached the entrance, I realized that the man was right behind me, his knife glinting in the dim light of the parking lot. With a sense of desperation, I pushed open the door and stumbled inside, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sought refuge from my pursuer. The diner was crowded and noisy, the sound of chatter and laughter filling the air as I scanned the room for help. But before I could make a move, the man appeared in the doorway, his eyes locking onto mine with a look of pure malice. With a sense of dread, I realized that I was trapped, with nowhere to run and no one to turn to for help. But just as I was bracing myself for the worst, I saw a glint of metal in the corner of my eye. It was a police officer, his gun drawn and pointed directly at the man standing in the doorway. "Drop the knife," he said, his voice firm and commanding. "You're under arrest." With a sense of relief flooding through me, I watched as the man complied, dropping the knife to the ground and raising his hands in surrender. And as the police officer led him away in handcuffs, I knew that I had escaped from the nightmare that had threatened to consume me. But even as I breathed a sigh of relief, I couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had changed me forever, that the memory of that rainy night would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was raining and I just wanted to get home at this point, but I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and now I found myself lost in the backwoods with no idea how to get back to the main road. As I continued down the narrow dirt path, my heart sank as I realized that I was completely alone, with no signs of civilization in sight. Panic began to rise in my chest as I tried to think of what to do next. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I saw a flicker of movement up ahead, the silhouette of several figures emerging from the shadows of the trees. My blood ran cold as I realized that I wasn't alone out here in the wilderness. I slowed the car to a stop, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as I watched the figures approach. They were locals, that much was clear from the way they moved with purpose through the forest, their eyes fixed on me with a mixture of suspicion and hostility. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising sense of fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I had to stay calm, had to find a way out of the situation before it was too late. But before I could even begin to formulate a plan, the group had reached my car, surrounding it on all sides and blocking any chance of escape. "Who are you?" one of them demanded, their voice harsh and accusing. "And what are you doing here?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat as I realized that these people were not here to help me. They were here to protect their territory, and I was the intruder. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I knew that I was in serious trouble. These people were armed and dangerous, and I was completely at their mercy. But just when I thought all hope was lost, A voice cut through the tension like a knife, breaking through the silence with its commanding tone. "Let him go," it said, its words ringing out loud and clear in the stillness of the forest. I turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, their presence commanding respect and authority. It was the leader of the group, and their word was law. Relief flooded through me as I watched the others step back, their hostility dissipating in the face of their leader's command. With trembling hands, I started up the car and drove away, my heart pounding in my chest as I let the backwoods behind me. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that had gripped me during my encounter with the hostile locals. It was a reminder that danger could lurk around any corner, even in the most remote and isolated of places. But despite the terror of that rainy night, I knew that I had escaped with my life, and for that, I was grateful. And as I finally found my way back to the main road, I vowed never to stray from the beaten path again. I had been driving for hours, the only company the monotonous hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. But now, with the storm raging outside, I knew I had to find shelter before it was too late. As I rounded a bend in the road, my headlights illuminated a dilapidated house looming in the darkness. It looked abandoned, but it was better than nothing. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I pulled over and cut the engine, grabbing my jacket as I stepped out into the pouring rain. The front door creaked open with a loud groan, revealing a dark interior that sent a shiver down my spine. But I had no other choice. With a deep breath, I stepped inside, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. The house was in a sorry state, the wallpaper peeling from the walls and the floorboards creaking underfoot. But despite its decrepit appearance, there was something strangely comforting about it, like a sanctuary from the storm raging outside. As I made my way through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if there were eyes watching me from the shadows, following my every move with a sense of malevolence that sent a chill down my spine. With each step I took, the feeling of unease grew stronger, until it was almost suffocating. I wanted to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible, but something held me back, a sense of curiosity that compelled me to keep exploring. And then, just as I was about to turn and run, I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible above the sound of the rain outside. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to make out the words. "Get out," it said, the voice sending a shiver down my spine. "Get out while you still can." I didn't need to be told twice. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and bolted for the door, my footsteps echoing through the empty house as I ran for my life. But just as I reached the front door, I heard another sound behind me, a low growl that froze me in my tracks. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest as I came face to face with the source of the noise. Standing before me was a figure, its features obscured by the darkness of the room. But even in the dim light, I could see the glint of malice in its eyes, the hunger that burned within them. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. With a scream, I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls as I fled from the house and back out into the storm. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, the rain soaking through my clothes as I fumbled with the keys. With trembling hands, I started up the engine and peeled out of there. The image of the figure burned into my mind like a nightmare I couldn't escape. As I drove away, the storm raging around me, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the pit of my stomach. I had escaped from the house, but I knew that it would haunt me for the rest of my days. It was a dark and rainy night, the kind of night where the rain seemed to fall in sheets, making it hard to see more than a few feet in front of you. I was driving home from a long day at work, the sound of the rain pounding against the roof of my car drowning out the radio. As I rounded a bend in the road, My headlights illuminated a group of figures standing in the middle of the road. Before I could react, they stepped out in front of my car, forcing me to slam on the brakes to avoid hitting them. My heart pounding in my chest, I rolled down my window to see what was going on. But before I could say anything, one of the figures approached my car, a menacing glint in his eye as he brandished a gun. "Hand over your valuables," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "And nobody gets hurt." Fear gripped me as I realized what was happening. I was being robbed, my life at the mercy of these armed strangers in the middle of nowhere. With trembling hands, I reached for my wallet and handed it over, praying that it would be enough to satisfy them. But as they rifled through my belongings, I could see the greed in their eyes, the hunger for more. I knew I had to do something, to find a way out of this nightmare before it was too late. But with nowhere to run and no one to help, I felt trapped, helpless against the armed robbers who held my fate in their hands. Desperation set in as I racked my brain for a way out. And then, in a moment of clarity, an idea struck me, a risky plan that just might work if I could pull it off. With a deep breath, I pretended to reach for something in the back seat of my car, distracting the robbers for just long enough to make my move. In one swift motion, I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal and tore away down the road, leaving the stunned robbers in my wake. As I sped away into the night, the adrenaline pumping through my veins, I knew I had escaped with my life. But the memory of that terrifying encounter would stay with me forever, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the darkness, waiting to strike when you least expect it. The rain was coming down hard as I trudged along the dark, deserted streets. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to shield myself from the cold that seemed to seep into my bones with every step. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty night, a lonely rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. And then, out of nowhere, a car pulled up beside me, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to accept the offer of help from a stranger. But the rain was coming down harder now, and I was soaked to the bone. With a sigh of relief, I climbed into the passenger seat and closed the door behind me. The driver was a man, his features obscured by the shadows of the car's interior. He offered me a friendly smile as he started up the engine and pulled back onto the road. I tried to relax, to let go of the fear that had been gnawing at me since I set out on my journey. But something about the man's demeanor set me on edge, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. As we drove, the silence between us grew thicker, punctuated only by the sound of the rain pounding against the windshield. I tried to strike up a conversation, to ease the tension that hung in the air like a dark cloud. But the man's responses were short and guarded, leaving me feeling more unsettled than before. And then, as we turned onto a deserted stretch of road, I felt a cold dread settle over me like a shroud. The man's smile had vanished, replaced by a look of intense concentration as he gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. I knew then that something was terribly wrong, that I had made a grave mistake in accepting this stranger's offer of help. But it was too late to turn back now, too late to escape the trap that had been set for me. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I was in danger. The man beside me was not who he claimed to be, and I was at his mercy, alone and vulnerable in the darkness. As we drove on, the tension in the car grew thicker, suffocating me with its weight. I could feel the man's eyes on me, watching my every move with a predatory gleam that sent shivers down my spine. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife, the blade glinting in the dim light of the car's interior. My heart leaped into my throat as I realized what was about to happen. With a surge of adrenaline, I threw open the car door and tumbled out onto the wet pavement, the sound of the man's shouts echoing in my ears as I scrambled to my feet and ran for my life. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the nearest house, pounding on the door until someone finally answered. I collapsed into their arms, gasping for breath as I tried to put into words the horror that I had just experienced. But even as I spoke, I knew that the nightmare was far from over. The memory of that rainy night would haunt me for the rest of my days. With each passing mile, the storm seemed to grow stronger until the sky was nothing but a thick blanket of dark clouds, obscuring any trace of the moon or stars. As the rain pounded against the windshield, I realized that I couldn't continue driving in these conditions. My visibility was practically non-existent, and the risk of getting into an accident was too great. With a sigh of resignation, I began scanning the roadside for a place to take shelter until the storm passed. And then, like a beacon in the darkness, I saw it, an abandoned rest stop, its withered sign barely visible through the curtain of rain. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. With a sense of relief, I turned up the highway and pulled into the gravel parking lot. The rest stop was a sad sight indeed, a relic of a bygone era, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in graffiti. But it was dry, and that was all that mattered. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out of the car, bracing myself against the wind as I made a dash for the entrance. The door creaked open with a rusty groan, revealing a dimly lit interior that smelled of mildew and decay. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should turn back and wait out the storm in my car. But then I heard a clap of thunder in the distance, and I knew that I didn't have a choice. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a loud bang, making me jump in surprise. I glanced around nervously, half expecting to see someone standing there, waiting to greet me. But the room was empty, save for a few scattered pieces of furniture and the sound of rain beating against the roof. I made my way further into the rest stop, my footsteps echoing off the walls as I explored the deserted building. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe. It was eerie, to say the least, but I tried to push aside my unease and focus on finding a dry place to wait out the storm. And then, just as I was about to give up hope, I heard voices coming from somewhere nearby. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I listened closer, I realized that the voices were real, and they were getting louder by the second. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest as I rounded a corner and came face to face with a group of vagrants huddled together in the corner of the room. They looked up at me with wary eyes, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. I tried to smile, to show them that I meant no harm. But the words caught in my throat as I saw the glint of something sharp in one of their hands. It was a knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light of the rest stop. I backed away slowly, my mind racing as I tried to come up with a plan. But before I could make a move, one of the vagrants stepped forward, blocking my path with a menacing scowl. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice low and threatening. "And what are you doing here?" I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry as I struggled to find the right words. But before I could respond, another member of the group lunged forward, brandishing their knife and slashing at the air in front of me. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that I was in serious danger. These people weren't just homeless vagrants looking for shelter from the storm. They were dangerous, and I was their unsuspecting prey. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, the sound of their shouts echoing in my ears as I raced towards the exit. I could feel their footsteps pounding after me, their voices growing louder with each passing moment. But I refused to give up hope. I knew that if I could just make it out of the rest stop, I might have a chance of escaping their clutches and finding help. And so I ran faster, pushing myself to the brink of exhaustion as I fought to stay one step ahead of my pursuers. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I burst through the door and into the open air, the rain washing over me like a wave of relief. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, panting and gasping for breath as I fumbled with the keys and started up the engine. As I peeled out of the parking lot and back onto the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the vagrants chasing after me. But the road was empty, save for the rain and the darkness. I let out a shaky breath, my hands still trembling on the wheel as I drove away from the abandoned rest stop and back towards civilization. It was a night I would never forget. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it home before the storm hit, but it seemed like Mother Nature had other plans. As I navigated through the winding back roads, the water pooled on the asphalt, making it difficult to see where I was going. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I hit a flooded section of road, my tires spinning helplessly in the rising waters. I cursed under my breath as I realized I was stuck, the water creeping up the sides of my car with each passing minute. Panic began to rise in my chest as I frantically tried to come up with a plan. I could call for help, but with no cell service out here in the middle of nowhere, I knew it would be hours before anyone arrived. And with the water continuing to rise, I didn't have that kind of time. Just when I was starting to lose hope, I saw headlights approaching in the distance. Relief flooded through me as I watched the car pull up alongside mine, the driver rolling down their window to offer assistance. "Need a hand?" they called out, their voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. I hesitated for a moment, my instinct screaming at me to be cautious. But desperation won out over caution, and I nodded gratefully as I stepped out of my car and into the downpour. The driver was a middle-aged man, his face weathered and worn from years of hard living. He smiled reassuringly as he offered me a hand, his grip surprisingly strong as he helped me onto the dry ground. "Thanks," I said, trying to ignore the nagging feeling of unease that tugged at the back of my mind. The man nodded, his smile widening as he gestured towards his car. "Hop in, I'll give you a lift into town. It's not safe to be out here alone in weather like this." I hesitated for a moment, my gut telling me that something wasn't right. But then I thought about the rising waters and a sinking feeling of dread that had been building in my chest, and I knew that I didn't have a choice. I climbed into the man's car, trying to push aside my fears as we drove off into the storm. But as the minutes turned into hours and we continued to drive further and further from civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I tried to ask the man where we were going, but he just smiled enigmatically and refused to answer. And as the rain continued to pour down around us, I felt a sense of unease settle over me like a heavy blanket. Finally, just when I was starting to lose hope, we pulled off the main road and onto a narrow dirt track that disappeared into the darkness. My heart began to race as I realized that we were heading into the unknown, with no sign of civilization in sight. I considered making a run for it, but the man's grip on the steering wheel was ironclad, and I knew that I wouldn't stand a chance against him in a fight. So I sat there in silence, my mind racing as I tried to come up with a plan. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw a break in the trees up ahead. Relief flooded through me as I realized that we were approaching a clearing, and beyond that, the lights of civilization glimmered in the distance. With a surge of adrenaline, I knew that this was my chance to escape. I waited until the man slowed the car to a stop at the edge of the clearing, and then I made my move. I flung open the door and leapt out of the car, my feet hitting the ground running as I sprinted towards the lights of town. Behind me, I heard the man shouting curses, but I didn't stop to look back. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, the rain pounding against my skin as I raced towards safety. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I burst through the tree line and into the open, my heart soaring as I saw the lights of town shining like a beacon in the distance. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest gas station, where I collapsed on the pavement in a heap, gasping for breath as I tried to process what had just happened. But even as I lay there, shaken and exhausted, I knew that I had survived. And as the rain continued to pour down around me, I said a silent prayer of thanks for my narrow escape.